There are bad losses in MMA, there are shocking losses. And then there are losses when you wake up the next morning and the entire MMA community is asking the same question. What the hell just happened? Tuesday night, Bella Mir walked into the UFC Apex as one of the biggest favorites we had ever seen in this sport. At around minus 6,000, the implied probability is 98.4%. Basically, the betting market was saying Bella Mir does not just win this fight, she wins this fight almost every single time. But then, Alex Apodaca went out there and beat her 29-28. Not by fluke, not by some freak knockout, and not because Bella blew out her knee. She went 15 minutes with her, stuffed her wrestling, outworked her, bloodied her nose, and won herself a unanimous decision. And that is why I think this fight creates something much more interesting than just an upset. It creates the Bella Mir Conundrum. Because I don't think the question is Bella Mir good? The question is, how good was Bella Mir before last night, and how good can she become after it? Because last night may have been the worst night of Bella Mir's young career. Or it might eventually become the most important night of it. Before we start talking about Bella, I think we have to talk about Alex Apodaca. Because the easiest way to analyze an upset is to make the favorite the entire story and what they didn't do. And I think that's personally just a little disrespectful to who actually won. Apodaca didn't walk into the cage thinking that she was going to lose. In fact, I personally found her mentality after the fight to be quite fascinating. She said she intentionally didn't look at the betting odds because she knew they were going to be bullshit and she wanted to stay present in the moment. That is such an important detail. Because Bella was fighting Bella Mir and Alex was fighting Alex Apodaca. Those sound like the same fight, but they're not. Bella had the NCAA championship pedigree, the Frank Mir name, the UFC relationship, the undefeated record, the hype, the expectations, the UFC NIL history, the talk about becoming a champion in multiple combat sports. Apodaca had none of that. All she had was a job to do, and she did it. She kept stuffing the takedown. She kept getting back up. She kept throwing. And perhaps more importantly, she didn't mentally collapse when the fight didn't go exactly according to her plan. And I think that's a huge part of this story. Because maybe Bella wasn't beaten by some extraordinary version of Alex Apodaca. Maybe she was beaten by a completely normal fighter who simply refused to be intimidated by the moment. Now, here's where I think Dana White actually made the most important observation after this fight. He talked about Bella not having deep water experience, and I think that's the single biggest factor. She came into this fight 4-0. 3 of those 4 wins came by submission. She had only gone the distance once. That's an incredible finishing record, but there's a hidden problem with an undefeated record built almost entirely on finishes. What happens when the finish isn't there? And mixed martial arts has a funny way of asking every single fighter that question. The first time your plan A fails is when you find out whether or not you have a plan B. What happens when plan A doesn't work? What happens when you're tired? What happens when your opponent isn't scared? What happens when your best weapon gets neutralized in a fight? What happens when you're 3 minutes into the third round and you're thinking, I have no idea how to win this fight right now? Bella never had to answer that question professionally, while Alex did. Apodaca had already been through multiple decision fights. She knew what 15 minutes felt like. She knew what it was like when a fight became ugly. She knew what it was like when an opponent wouldn't go away. Bella knew how to finish people. Tuesday night, she had to learn how to win a fight that did not want to be finished. And those are 2 very different skills. And this is where I think the fight becomes even more interesting, because Bella's wrestling wasn't just bad, it was being challenged. She went 1 for 6 on takedown attempts. She did have nearly 4 minutes of control time, so it's not like she couldn't physically impose herself on Apodaca, but she couldn't consistently get the fight where she wanted it, and that's what mattered. Because Bella's entire identity as an MMA prospect was built around the idea that if she could get her hands on you, there was a very good chance you're going to have a terrible evening. Apodaca basically just said no, and she kept saying it. The first takedown didn't work, the next one didn't work, the next exchange didn't work. Suddenly, Bella had to fight a fight that she really hadn't been forced to fight before. Apodaca also deserves credit for the way she fought on the feet. She pressured forward, she mixed stances a lot, she used the jab, she attacked the body. She made Bella react. By the second round, Bella was bleeding from the nose and Apodaca was just starting to look even more comfortable. The reported significant strike numbers tell a huge story too. 48 for Apodaca and 30 for Bella. It's not like this was a robbery decision. This was not a lucky decision. That's a fighter who was just gradually chipping away and taking control as the fight went on. And that's where the first real question comes about. What if she simply wasn't ready for this level of resistance yet? Was this too early? This is probably the biggest argument in Bella's defense. You know, the people, they see NCAA national champion and the first thing they hear is ready for the UFC. But wrestling and MMA aren't interchangeable necessarily. They are very closely related, but they're not the same sport. Bella became the first NCAA women's 145-pound national champion, and that's legitimately historic. But MMA asks you to solve a completely different mathematical equation. In wrestling, you don't have to worry about getting punched when you're entering a shot. You don't have to worry about kicks to the body. You don't have to manage 5 different ranges at once. You don't have to decide whether a takedown is worth eating 3 punches for. You don't have to fight somebody who is actively trying to make you afraid and actively trying to hurt you. And there's another issue. Bella Mir is only 23 years old. 4 professional MMA fights before this, that's basically nothing. Think about that. We sometimes talk about undefeated prospects like they're finished products, but they're not. They're just prototypes. Bella Mir isn't supposed to have everything figured out at 23 years old and 4 professional fights into her career. The crazy part is that the betting market treated her like she did. And maybe that was the real mistake. Maybe it wasn't Bella Mir and what she did or didn't do. Maybe it was how much pressure we put on her, how much expectation we had for her this early in her career. Maybe the problem was that everybody, including the market, mistook potential for completion. But here's the other side. Maybe Bella was just bad that night. And that's okay to say too. Every fighter has themselves nights where they just do not look like themselves. Sometimes it's the opponent that gets you, or the moment, or your body doesn't cooperate, or your brain doesn't cooperate. And sometimes you just have a bad or rough night in the office. The pressure surrounding this fight was ridiculous. I mean, imagine being 23 years old, you're the daughter of Frank Mir, you're an NCAA champion, you're 4-0. Dana White has personally involved himself in your career for years. You're being talked about as a future UFC star. You're trying to become a champion in multiple sports, and now the entire world is telling you you're supposed to win this. That's a completely different psychological experience than, let's see what happens. This is a difference between fighting to win and fighting because you're afraid of losing. And I wonder if Bella ever crossed that line during Tuesday night. Because when your opponent's greatest weapon becomes the fact that nothing is supposed to go wrong for you, pressure starts doing some very, very strange things. Now we get to the uncomfortable part. Frank Mir. And I want to be very, very careful with this one, because saying that Bella benefited from her father's name does not mean the same thing as saying she didn't earn what she has gotten in this life or where she's at. Those are completely different statements. Frank Mir is a UFC legend. He was a 2-time UFC heavyweight champion. He was one of the most dangerous submission artists in heavyweight MMA. And Bella kind of grew up inside that world. That's an advantage. There's no shame in that, but that is an advantage. If your dad is Michael Jordan, you're probably going to have access to a basketball court. You know what I'm saying? If your dad is Tiger Woods, you're probably going to pick up a golf club every once in a while. And if your dad is Frank Mir, you're probably going to learn what an armbar is before most kids, learn that. But here's the philosophical question. When you've been told your entire life that you're special, how do you know which part of your confidence is earned and which part was given to you by others? And I really want you guys to think about that and, write that in the comments as well if you want. I think that's really important. And I'm going to say it again. I think it's deep. When you've been told your entire life that you're special, how do you know which part of the confidence you have is earned and which part was given to you? That's brutal. And I don't mean that as an insult to Bella at all. I'm a Bella Mir fan. It's something that every child of greatness has to confront. Because eventually you have to stop being Frank Mir's daughter and just become Bella Mir. That's the real test. Not whether she can beat Alex Apodaca, whether she can construct an identity that exists completely independently of her dad. And ironically, losing might be the first step towards achieving that. This really only gets deeper. There is another layer to this thing. Bella became the UFC's first NIL ambassador as a college athlete. Dana White has openly talked about being involved in her career for years. He even admitted after the fight that he was extremely biased towards her. That doesn't prove that favoritism caused anything for her, but it does prove something very interesting to me. Bella has had access to elite environments, attention, the entire UFC ecosystem, and she had access to people who believed in her before the average fan even knew who she was. That to me is privilege. But privilege is not the same thing as fraud. Do not get that twisted. That is an important distinction that we have to make. Privilege can give you a better starting point, a better starting line, but it cannot make that cage smaller. It cannot make your takedowns land. It cannot make someone stop punching you. And last night, when that door closed, Alex Apodaca did not care who Bella's father was. And that's one of the most beautiful and yet cruel things about MMA. The cage is one of the few places in the world where your resume cannot physically help you. And we can address the word that everybody is using. Fraud. Was Bella Mir exposed? I don't know. I think that's a little bit too simplistic of a way of thinking it. Did she get fraud checked? Absolutely. And that's not necessarily an insult. Every MMA prospect eventually gets fraud checked. It's basically an MMA test, a version of an exam or a test. Did she pass that test? This time she did not. But, I mean, you can look incredible against someone who cannot solve your style, but what happens when somebody has all the tools to make you uncomfortable? Bella's first 4 professional fights didn't answer that question. Her fight against Alex Apodaca did. And here's the thing. A fraud check doesn't always mean you're a fraud and that's what you are for the rest of your career, the rest of your life. Sometimes it just means we finally found the part of your game that needs some work. If Bella fixes it, last night becomes incredibly valuable. If she doesn't, then maybe the questions were right. But I just don't think we are quite ready to answer the fraud question yet. Bella's biggest fight is still coming up, and it'll be from now until her next fight. Can she survive her own mind? If I'm Bella Mir, I don't spend the next 6 months trying to prove that Alex Apodaca got lucky. That's the worst possible response that she could have. Don't obsess over the 29-28 scorecards or the fact that you were a minus 6,000 favorite. Don't listen to what people on Twitter say. Don't listen to what Frank has to say to you, even though, it could be potentially beneficial. Don't obsess over Dana and what he said. Don't even obsess about getting over to the UFC again. Go into the gym and ask one question. What happens when my wrestling doesn't work? Because that's the question that Alex gave her. How good is your striking when you can't rely on the takedown? How good is your cage work and your conditioning and your decision making when you're tired? Can you establish a range? Can you make adjustments in between rounds? Can you lose the first round and then not mentally unravel going on in the fight? Can you get hurt, get cracked, and still think clearly? I think that's how Bella turns this loss into an investment. Because she just paid a very expensive tuition fee. She got something no undefeated prospect can buy, though. 15 minutes of information about herself. And this is where I think Bella's career gets really interesting. The danger isn't losing to Alex Apodaca. The danger is what Bella tells herself that loss means. Because there are 2 ways this can go. Version 1, Bella's ego gets destroyed. She starts saying she isn't as good as everyone told her she was. She starts chasing finishes and forcing things in fights. She starts trying to prove something in the wrong way. And every fight becomes an argument with the person she was before August 25th when she lost to Alex Apodaca. And I think that's a dangerous place for her to live in. But version 2 is completely different. Bella could realize, I'm 23. I've got 4 fights. I just discovered 10 things I need to improve. That's terrifying for the rest of the division and for the future opponents that she has to face. Because now you have an NCAA champion who knows she needs to become a better MMA fighter. So can Bella still make the UFC? My answer, yes, absolutely. And honestly, I don't think that's particularly controversial. She's only 23. She is that NCAA champion. She's a talented grappler. She's already demonstrated a finishing ability in MMA. And Dana White himself said the loss doesn't mean her future is over, pointing to her age and lack of experience. But the UFC isn't disappearing, and Bella isn't old. Her athletic ability isn't disappearing, and she just received the exact kind of experience that her resume was missing. The question isn't whether she can make the UFC. The question is, what version of Bella Mir eventually makes the UFC? The Bella Mir who was supposed to be there, or the Bella Mir who earned it the hard way? Because those could be 2 different fighters. And I think this loss can potentially help her. And that's why I don't think that Tuesday night proved Bella Mir is a fraud. I also don't think it proved that she's a future UFC champion. It proves something that's a little bit more interesting to me. We don't know yet. There's a huge question mark on Bella Mir and what her career is or what it's going to be. And for the first time in Bella Mir's professional career, she doesn't know either. That's the conundrum. Before last night, Bella's story was almost too clean. Frank Mir's daughter, NCAA champion, UFC NIL athlete, undefeated submission machine, future UFC star. And then Alex Apodaca walked into the cage and ripped a hole right through the certainty of that story. But maybe that's what Bella needed. Because you can't build an authentic fighter without some adversity. At some point, every great fighter has to meet the version of themselves that isn't guaranteed to win. And last night, Bella met her version. Now, she didn't quit. She didn't get finished. She went the whole 15 minutes. She lost. And now she has a choice. She can spend the rest of her career trying to prove that she shouldn't have lost to Alex Apodaca, or she can become the fighter who would never lose that fight again. And those are completely different futures. So maybe the question isn't, was Bella Mir exposed? Maybe the better question is, what does Bella Mir look like after getting exposed? Because sometimes the loss isn't the end of the prospect. Sometimes it's just the beginning.